The moment Alan Dershowitz leaned forward, smirking, the audience knew an ambush was coming. His voice, sharp and self-assured, carried the weight of decades spent towering over opponents in courtrooms and lecture halls. The stage lights gleamed. Against his glasses, his every movement dripping with the confidence of a man who had always been heard, always been respected, and always believed he would have the last word. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Cameras tightened their focus, microphones hovered in perfect stillness, and a hush swept through the audience as if the air itself knew something combustible was about to ignite. This was no ordinary exchange. It was a performance, a duel, a high-stakes moment where reputation and dignity hung in the balance. Dershowitz began his approach the way only he could, through ridicule. With a sly grin, he peppered his words with condescension, dismissing Jasmine Crockett as if she were nothing more than a student fumbling in the presence of the master. His tone wasn't just argumentative. It was belittling, meant to shrink her stature, to remind everyone watching that he was the giant in the room. His questions weren't questions at all, but traps carefully laid snares designed to embarrass, to corner, to humiliate. And for a moment, it seemed like the stage belonged entirely to him. His voice rose with theatrical precision, his hands slicing the air as if carving victory out of thin oxygen. The audience shifted uneasily, some nodding, others wincing, all waiting to see if Crockett would falter under the weight of his attack. But there was something different in the way she sat, calm, steady, unflinching. Where he leaned in with a predator's grin, she remained grounded, her composure radiating an authority that came not from years of elite training, but from years of living with struggle, surviving dismissals, and rising stronger each time. Had walked into this moment convinced it would be another easy triumph, another feather in the cap of his storied career. What he didn't realize was that the ground beneath him was shifting, that his own arrogance was laying the foundation for his undoing. What happened next left him in the entire room mutterly speechless, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just ready. She was built for this. The clash between Alan Dershowitz and Jasmine Crockett was never just about one exchange of words. It was about two Americas staring each other down under the hot glare of the lights. On one side stood the embodiment of elite power, a Harvard professor, celebrated lawyer, a man who had built his name defending the untouchable and walking out of battles with his chin higher than before. On the other stood a freshman congresswoman, young, black, unpolished in the way elites sneer at, but sharp, rounded, and carrying with her the weight of every community too often shut out of the room. That is what made this moment so combustible. Dershowitz wasn't simply questioning her, he was sending a message. He had spent his career teaching students how to dismantle arguments with surgical precision, lacing every phrase with the subtle mockery of a man who believed his intellect was armor. To him, this wasn't a debate, it was a stage where his legend was meant to grow taller, and for most of his life, that strategy had worked. He bulldozed, he belittled, he intimidated. His reputation as an intellectual gladiator had made his words echo far beyond lecture halls and courtrooms. People expected him to win simply because he always had. To stand against Dershowitz was to invite humiliation, as the kind that lived forever in viral clips and late-night ridicule. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't wired to crumble. She had entered Congress not with the polish of privilege, but with the grit of survival. She had been underestimated in courtrooms, spoken over in hearings, caricatured in headlines, and dismissed in private conversations. And yet each time, she returned sharper, stronger, more relentless. To some, her youth and fire were weaknesses. To others, they were precisely what made her dangerous to the old order Dershowitz represented. That night, the imbalance in the room was obvious. Here was the seasoned professor, wrapped in the prestige of an institution that had long served as a gatekeeper of American power. And across from him sat a woman who was never meant to be at that table, at least not in his eyes. To him, this was his stage. To her, this was her proving ground. The audience sensed the stakes. This wasn't just a clash of words. It was a collision of worlds. Would the polished arrogance of an elite once again flatten the voice of someone who represented the marginalized? Or would authenticity, lived experience, and calm defiance finally shatter the myth of intellectual invincibility? The tension built. With every word exchanged, with every smirk from Dershowitz, and every steady glance from Crockett, the room had already decided the script in their minds. He was the giant. She was the underdog. Everyone thought they knew how this would end. They were wrong. Alan Dershowitz did not arrive in that room as a blank slate. He carried with him the weight of a name that had hovered over American legal and political life for decades. To many, he was the quintessential courtroom gladiator, sharp, theatrical, relentless. His reputation was built not only on intellect but on the spectacle of dominance. He knew how to tower over an opponent, to turn every phrase into a weapon, to make a room feel like his personal arena in lecture halls. Students often watched in awe as he dissected arguments with surgical precision, his voice rising and falling. With the rhythm of a performer who knew exactly when to twist the knife, in courtrooms, he turned trials into theater, commanding attention with every objection. Every cross-examination, every smirk that suggested his opponent was hopelessly outmatched. For years, this style had made him a star. People leaned in when he spoke, not just because of what he said, but because of how ruthlessly he said it. But his career was not without shadows. Dershowitz had built notoriety not only by teaching law, but by defending some of the most controversial figures in America. From O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein, his name was often linked to clients who symbolized the worst abuses of wealth and power. To his admirers, this was proof of his devotion to the principle that everyone deserved a defense. To his critics, it was arrogance disguised as principle, willingness to shield the powerful while dismissing the vulnerable. Either way, the pattern was clear. Dershowitz thrived in controversy, feeding off the storm rather than shying away from it, and through it all, one trait defined him: intimidation. He was the professor who made students stumble, the lawyer who left witnesses rattled, the pundit who smirked his way through television debates. He wielded his Harvard pedigree like a sword, a credential that made people hesitate before challenging him. His words were often less about persuasion and more about domination, about reminding those across from him that they did not belong in his league. On paper, his resume sparkled. Harvard Law, bestseller author, renowned trial lawyer, a man who had lectured presidents and sparred with the most formidable legal minds in the country. But in practice, that glittering resume was beginning to fray. Years of controversial positions had chipped away at his credibility. The once unquestioned authority of his voice now carried a faint echo of defensiveness. It's a sense of a man fighting to preserve the myth of his own invincibility. That fragility was invisible to him as he faced Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was simply another opponent to belittle, another sparring partner to crush under the weight of his experience. He leaned into his familiar tactics, the smirk, the patronizing tone, the cutting questions designed not to invite dialogue but to corner and embarrass. In his mind, the outcome was inevitable. He was Alan Dershowitz. She was Jasmine Crockett. This was not a battle, it was a performance. He believed the ending had already been written. But the audience watching saw something different. They saw a giant puffed up with decades of unchallenged arrogance, a man so used to winning that he no longer understood how much his armor had cracked. His pedigree, once untouchable, now looked fragile when weighed against the rising force seated across from him. The sheen of Harvard prestige dulled in the face of raw authenticity, the kind that could not be taught in classrooms or polished in lecture halls. This was the Goliath Jasmine Crockett was about to face, a man who had spent his life using power to silence others who believed intimidation was the same as victory. Yet, what Dershowitz didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that Crockett's life had been a masterclass in facing giants. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble hallways of power or the oak-paneled classrooms of Ivy League schools. It began in the everyday grit of a working-class household, where dignity wasn't inherited but earned through persistence and resilience. She grew up in a world where opportunities weren't handed out. They had to be fought for, often twice as hard, simply to be recognized. Her parents instilled in her the values of grit, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that voices from the margins mattered just as much as voices from the podiums. From an early age, Crockett understood what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers sometimes doubted her potential. Classmates occasionally dismissed her ambition. The world tried to place her in a box, to remind her of boundaries she was not supposed to cross. But each slight only fueled her. Where some saw obstacles, she saw challenges to outwork, to outlast, to overcome. That spirit led her to law. Not because it was glamorous or prestigious, but because it was a weapon, a tool. To defend those who had no shield, she chose the courtroom as her battlefield, standing shoulder to shoulder with the marginalized, the poor, and the overlooked. There she built a reputation not as someone who bowed to power, but as someone who confronted it. Judges, prosecutors, and opposing attorneys quickly realized that Crockett, despite her youth, was no easy opponent. She carried the fire of lived experience into every case, sharpening her voice not to intimidate, but to insist on fairness. Her work became deeply tied to civil rights. Two cases where the stakes were not just legal, but existential. She represented clients who had been trampled by systems that often protected the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. And when she spoke, her words were laced not with the detachment of an ivory tower scholar, but with the urgency of someone who knew firsthand what injustice looked like in daily life. Every courtroom prepared her for something greater. When opposing, counsel rolled their eyes at her. She didn't flinch. When judges cut her off, she didn't shrink. When colleagues whispered that she wasn't seasoned enough, wasn't polished enough, wasn't their kind of lawyer, she learned to let her work, her persistence, and her victories speak louder than any insult. Each dismissal hardened her resolve. Each belittling word became fuel. So when politics called, it was a natural evolution. She had seen the system from the inside, and she knew its cracks weren't just legal, they were structural. As a legislator, she carried that same unrelenting focus into committee hearings, where she often found herself surrounded by colleagues who tried to dismiss her voice. They underestimated her sharpness, her ability to cut through pretense with pointed clarity. In those moments, Crockett revealed her second gift, resilience in hostile spaces. She learned how to stand firm while others tried to rattle her. She mastered the art of silence, of waiting just long enough before delivering a pointed response that made the room pause. And with each clash, she grew more formidable. Her colleagues, whether they admitted it or not, recognized that she was not simply participating in politics. She was reshaping the energy in every room she entered. Crockett didn't carry the armor of privilege. She carried scars, and in those scars was her strength. Every insult she had ever endured was training for this exact moment. Every time she had been told she didn't belong, she built the patience, the steadiness, and the confidence that now defined her presence. So when she sat across from Alan Dershowitz, she was not intimidated. She had faced men like him before, men with credentials, with privilege, with reputations so towering that they assumed their words alone could end conversations. To them, her presence was unexpected, her defiance inconvenient, her voice too sharp for comfort. But to Crockett, this was nothing new. Her life had been a constant rehearsal for encounters exactly like this. The smirk she now faced was no different from the dismissive looks she had endured in courtrooms. The arrogance dripping from his words was no different from the patronizing tone of colleagues who once thought she was out of her depth. Dershowitz might have seen himself as the Goliath, but for Crockett, giants were a familiar sight to hand. One she had learned to topple not with noise, but with precision. And so, when Dershowitz tried to humiliate her, when he leaned into his arsenal of arrogance, he didn't corner her. He handed her the mic drop of a lifetime. The clash did not unfold gently. From the moment Dershowitz launched his first volley, the pace quickened like a storm rolling in over a quiet horizon. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and cutting, layering, his words with the practiced rhythm of a man who had bulldozed through countless debates before. He pressed, interrupted, and talked over her, as if sheer volume could substitute for clarity. His tone carried not just disagreement, but dismissal, as though Crockett's presence at the table itself was an error that needed correcting. Each time she opened her mouth to respond, He would pounce, scudding in mid-sentence, smirking at the suggestion that her perspective could rival his decades of credentials. His sentences swelled with pomp, his hand gestures slicing through the air like a conductor orchestrating not a conversation, but a takedown. To him, this was dominance. 2. Those watching, it teetered dangerously close to desperation. Yet across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat steady. Her face betrayed none of the irritation that buzzed in the room. Her posture was upright, calm, almost defiant in its stillness. Where his energy was frenetic, hers was composed. Where his words came fast and clipped, hers were measured, deliberate, restrained. And it was that restraint that made the contrast impossible to ignore. The audience began to feel it before they could name it. The imbalance was striking, one man fighting to drown the room in noise, one woman refusing to let him pull her into the chaos. Viewers shifted in their seats, some frowning, others whispering quietly. The moderators, tasked with maintaining order, looked on with tight expressions. Aware that something bigger than an exchange of ideas was taking place, Dershowitz grew more insistent, his interruptions more obvious, his laughter more forced. It was the laugh of a man convinced he was winning, even as the cracks in his performance began to show. He doubled down, as men like him often did, mistaking condescension for persuasion. Each barb was meant to corner her, to strip her of authority, but each one seemed to float past her like arrows bouncing off armor. Crockett's eyes never wavered. She allowed him to expend his energy, to fill the room with noise, to display his confidence so thoroughly that it became indistinguishable from arrogance. She let him talk over her because she knew the audience was watching more than the words. They were watching the demeanor, the energy, the poise. And on that front, the contrast could not have been clearer. Every second stretched longer than the last. The tension in the room thickened, almost tangible, as if the air itself had weight. The audience leaned forward, waiting for her response, knowing instinctively that her silence was not weakness, but preparation. And then, without warning, it shifted. The moderator's eyes flicked toward her. Dershowitz, mid-drant, paused to catch his breath. The crowd, restless only moments before, quieted. The room grew tense. Every second stretched, then silence fell. The silence stretched, brittle and heavy, as if the entire room had agreed to hold its breath. Dershowitz, hands poised, mouth half open, looked ready to pounce again. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She simply leaned into the microphone, her expression serene, her tone steady, her eyes locked onto his like steel tempered in fire. "Professor," she began softly, the single word carrying the weight of centuries of deference flipped into something sharper, stronger. The quietness of her voice forced everyone to lean in, compelled attention in a way that volume never could. "You've made a career out of talking over people, but you're not going to talk over me." A ripple moved through the audience, half gasp, half stunned silence. Dershowitz blinked, thrown off by the calm refusal. She continued, each word precise, deliberate. "You stand here with your resume, your titles, your decades of courtroom theatrics, and you think that makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something, sir, those titles, those accolades, they don't erase the truth. They don't erase the arrogance. And they don't erase the fact that the people you've dismissed your whole career are the same people I came here to represent." Her words landed like blows, but not shouted ones, measured, devastating strikes that made their impact through control. Every pause she allowed, every second of stillness, became its own form of punctuation. Dershowitz shifted in his chair, a confident grin faltering ever so slightly. Crockett's voice sharpened. "You think power is about how loudly you can? Speak how quickly you can interrupt, how ruthlessly you can demean. But power, real power, is about listening. It's about standing firm when someone like you tries to make you small. And it's about making sure that the people who've never had a voice finally get to be heard." A murmur swept through the audience, some clapping before catching themselves, others leaning forward as though gravity itself pulled them closer. Crockett let the moment hang, Then she went in deeper. See, Professor, every insult I've ever endured about my race, about my gender, about my background, wasn't a wound. It was training. Training for moments exactly like this one. Because when men like you try to use arrogance as a weapon, you forget something critical. We've been surviving arrogance all our lives. We've had two, gasps echoed. The front row covered her mouth, eyes wide. The moderator sat frozen, pens dangling in midair. Crockett pressed forward, her rhythm steady, her control unshakable. And when you dismiss me, you're not just dismissing me. You're dismissing every young black girl who was told she didn't belong in a classroom. You're dismissing every immigrant who was told they'd never understand the system. You're dismissing every working-class kid who was told they'd never sit at the table. But here I am, sitting, speaking, refusing to be silent. The audience broke, spontaneous applause bubbling up despite attempts to maintain order. Moderators raised their hands to quiet the crowd, but their own faces betrayed a smirk of recognition. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a takedown. And still Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in again, her gaze unwavering. You can stack 1,000 Ivy League degrees on this table, and it still won't outweigh lived experience. You can raise your voice, but you can't raise your truth above mine, because your truth is about defending the powerful. Mine is about defending the people you've ignored. And I promise, when history looks back, it won't remember how loud you shouted. It'll remember who stood tall. Each word landed like a thunderclap. Dershowitz's shoulders stiffened, his lips tightening into a thin line. The man who had spent his career wielding words like weapons now sat in silence, outmatched by the very poise he had tried to bulldoze. And in that silence, the world outside the room was already exploding. Cutaways imagined, Twitter feeds scrolling furiously. Crockett just destroyed Dershowitz live on stage. This is how you handle arrogance, new political icon unlocked. Hashtags began trending before she had even finished her sentence. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Silence by Truth. Hashtag Built for This. TikTok edits, Instagram reels, viral memes, on real time, fueled by the force of her words. Crockett, aware but undistracted, finished with the kind of grace that belongs only to those who know they've shifted the ground beneath them. She sat back slowly, her hands folded neatly, her eyes never leaving his. And in that stillness, one truth became impossible to deny. Alan Dershowitz, for once, had no words. But the aftermath was even bigger than the showdown itself. The moment the debate stage lights dimmed, the internet lit up. Within minutes, hashtags shot up the trending charts. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Silence by Dignity. Hashtag Built for This.
Ash!
What had begun as a tense intellectual sparring match now erupted into a cultural earthquake. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm, but devastating. Takedowns spread like wildfire, each replay gaining millions of views as stunned. Audiences shared the moment across every platform imaginable. Twitter feeds exploded with disbelief and admiration. I just witnessed a masterclass in grace under fire, one journalist wrote, racking up tens of thousands of retweets. A viral meme surfaced. Dershowitz, frozen mid-silence, captioned, "When the Harvard degree meets real-world experience." Another clip slowed down to cinematic effect. It highlighted Crockett's line, "Every insult I've ever endured was training for this moment." The comment section beneath was flooded with applause emojis, fire icons, and declarations like this gave me chills. Celebrities joined the chorus. A-list actors posted snippets of her speech with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." Musicians remixed her mic drop into sound bites layered over beats, instantly turning into viral TikTok tracks. Influencers stitched reaction videos, eyes wide, hands on their faces, whispering, "She really just said that." Each reaction amplified. The Aratus wasn't just politics. It was cultural theater at its highest level. Meanwhile, Dershowitz's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Memes mocked his expression. Screenshots of him blinking in silence. GIFs of him shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Captions reading, "When your intimidation tactics stop working," or "Professor got professored." Satirical threads dubbed him the Goliath of arrogance, toppled by Crockett's slingshot of truth. Commentators on late-night shows joked that Dershowitz had finally learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a cross-examination he couldn't control. News outlets framed it as a generational and cultural clash. Headlines read, "Crockett redefines power in viral debate showdown, and when silence spoke louder than Dershowitz." Analysts dissected the moment frame by frame, noting the contrast: his impatience against her composure, his arrogance collapsing under her poise. The narrative crystallized quickly. This was bigger than a soundbite. It was symbolism. Ordinary viewers, many who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before, posted heartfelt reflections. A young law student wrote, "I'd been told my whole life I'd never be taken seriously in the courtroom. Tonight, I saw myself in her." An immigrant father shared, "For the first time, my daughter watched a debate and said, 'That woman looks like us. That woman makes me proud.'" The ripple effect extended far beyond the theater. It touched kitchen tables, college campuses, in workplace break rooms. It wasn't long before activists began tying the moment to larger struggles linking Crockett's calm defiance to civil rights battles past and present. Editorials compared her poise to Fannie Lou Hamer's grit, Shirley Chisholm's courage, and Barack Obama's coolness under pressure. She wasn't just responding to Dershowitz, she was stepping into a lineage of dignity as resistance. And the more the clip circulated, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a debate moment. It was becoming a movement. People printed her words on posters, shared them as daily affirmations, even adopted them as slogans at protests. "Every insult I've endured was training for this moment" turned into a rallying cry, painted across murals and tweeted with pride. For Dershowitz, silence became his legacy. For Crockett, it was ignition. She hadn't only silenced a man who built his career on domination, she had inspired millions to believe once again that arrogance could be defeated by dignity. And yet, as the dust settled and the applause thundered across both real and digital arenas, one question loomed larger than all the hashtags. What would this moment mean for her future, and for the country that had just watched a new icon rise? Because Crockett's triumph was only the beginning. When the headlines began to fade and the trending hashtags slowed, what lingered wasn't just the memory of a sharp exchange between two political figures. It was the feeling, a collective shiver that ran through people who, for once, saw arrogance fold under dignity. Jasmine Crockett herself made sure no one mistook the moment as personal glory. In interviews that followed, she reminded audiences, "This was never about me versus him. It was about truth versus intimidation. It was about service versus elitism." Those words reframed the spectacle. It wasn't just a viral clip, it was a parable. For decades, voices like Dershowitz's loud, credentialed, unyielding had dominated the national stage. They spoke with the confidence of institutions at their back, expecting reverence by default. But Crockett's quiet strength reminded the country that power doesn't always look like a Harvard degree or a booming courtroom voice. Sometimes it looks like refusing to shrink. Sometimes it looks like meeting arrogance with unshakable composure, until the arrogance collapses under its own weight. The lesson rang far beyond the theater where it unfolded. In classrooms, teachers played the clip to show students how to confront bullies without becoming one. In community centers, organizers quoted Crockett's words as proof that justice isn't about credentials, but about conviction, and in countless homes, parents replayed the debate for their children, saying, "Look, this is what dignity looks like." What Crockett demonstrated was more than rhetorical skill. It was a moral inversion. She took the hierarchy that Dershowitz represented, the lead over common, arrogance over humility, exclusion over belonging, and flipped it. Not by shouting louder, but by standing taller. Not by humiliating, but by refusing humiliation. That is what made the moment unforgettable. And in the broader American story, it echoed a truth the nation has wrestled with since its founding, that representation matters.
You're right.
That dignity is not granted from the top down, but claimed from the ground up. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the countless people who have been spoken over, ignored, and underestimated. By holding her ground, she made their ground a little firmer too, her silence. And those beats where Dershowitz fumbled was louder than his shouts. Her calm was more enduring than his bravado, and her dignity outlived his arrogance. That's the moral that stuck. That's why the clip kept circulating, why the words kept resonating. People weren't just entertained, they were validated. They saw proof that arrogance is not invincible, that elitism is not eternal, and that service rooted in authenticity will always eventually expose pretense. In the end, Crockett's victory wasn't measured in applause, trending hashtags, or even headlines. It was measured in a renewed belief that truth, spoken with dignity, could still silence arrogance. And that belief was contagious, because as people replayed the moment again and again, the question wasn't how did she silence him? It was, what can we silence next with dignity as our weapon? Alan Dershowitz walked into that debate certain he could embarrass Jasmine Crockett, certain his smirk and status would bulldoze her into silence. Instead, it was he who sat speechless, while she spoke not only for herself, but for everyone who has ever been underestimated, tried to make it personal, but what unfolded became universal. Because this was never about ego. It was never about titles. It was about something deeper, who we want to be as a nation. Do we want to reward arrogance? Or do we want to elevate dignity? Do we cling to elitism, or do we honor service? That's the real question this moment answered. And the answer rang loud and clear in Crockett's calm voice. Her silence was louder than his shouts. Her dignity outlived his arrogance. And her example reminded us all that truth, when spoken with conviction, can break through even the thickest walls of pretense. But here's the thing, this story doesn't end on that stage. It continues with us. With how we carry this lesson into our conversations, our communities, our choices. It continues every time we decide that arrogance won't define us. Dignity will. So if you believe dignity always silences arrogance, share this story, pass it forward. Let it inspire someone else who needs to hear it tonight. And if you want to keep amplifying voices, rewriting history, voices that remind us of who we can be at our best, subscribe, join this community, and help. Make sure these stories are never forgotten, because arrogance makes headlines, but dignity makes history.